Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are embarking on a journey into the foundational world of information security and privacy controls.
That's right.
Think of us as your guides, maybe, helping you navigate some core building blocks that organizations use to protect systems and information. Our source material for this deep dive is a key document in the field, NIST SP 800-53 Revision 5.
Exactly. Yeah, we've been given a selection of excerpts from this, absolutely crucial publication, and we're specifically focusing on the initial families outlined in Chapter 3, clauses 3.1 through 3.7.
Okay.
These aren't just, technical mandates. They're really the bedrock principles.
Mhm.
Our mission is to extract the most crucial insights, the practical takeaways from what can sometimes feel like, dense policy-heavy material.
Right.
So we're going to focus on access control, awareness and training, audit and accountability, assessment, authorization, and monitoring, configuration management, contingency planning, and identification and authentication. That's quite a list.
It is.
But together, these families really lay the essential groundwork for establishing a robust security and privacy posture within really any organization.
And we're going to tackle them just as the source material presents them, family by family, control by control within those families. It's a structured approach, almost like building a house from the ground up, to help you get well-informed quickly. Along the way, we hope to uncover some surprising facts and maybe generate a few aha moments as we unpack these concepts together.
Yeah, we'll help you see not just what these controls require, but really why they matter so deeply and how they fit into the bigger picture of managing risk. Especially in a world where, let's face it, information overload is constant and threats are always evolving.
Definitely.
So consider us your instructors for this session, walking you through these fundamental requirements. Let's dive in and unpack these essential concepts.
All right, let's kick things off with the very first family we're diving into, access control, known as AC. At its heart, this family is all about who gets into your system and, just as importantly, what they're allowed to do once they are there. It's kind of the digital gatekeeper.
Oh, absolutely. This is arguably the most fundamental security area.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't control who accesses what, nothing else really matters, does it?
True.
The source material lays out controls like AC3, titled Access Enforcement.
Yeah.
What's truly fascinating here, looking at the specifics, is how it talks about enforcing approved authorizations for logical access to information and system resources. It's not enough just to have a policy saying who can access what.
Right.
AC3 demands that the system itself must actually enforce those rules. It has to mediate access between what the source calls active entities or subjects.
Okay, subjects.
Yeah, things like users or processes acting on behalf of users and passive entities or objects.
So the subjects are the actors trying to get at something, and the objects are the resources they're trying to access, like files or databases.
Precisely. Objects are the actual things you're protecting. Databases, files, records, devices, specific programs, or even, subsections or domains within a larger system.
Okay.
The source discussion is careful to differentiate this from physical access controls. Those fall under a different family entirely, PE, for physical and environmental protection.
Right, we're not talking about key cards here.
No.
Yeah.
AC3 deals with the digital realm. It also makes a really crucial distinction that's, easy to overlook sometimes. Access enforcement can be implemented at the overall system level, but for enhanced security and privacy, the mechanisms are often employed at a more granular level.
More specific.
Yeah, specifically within individual applications or services running on the system.
So implementing enforcement at the application level means, like, the database itself might enforce who sees certain records, even if the operating system allowed them basic access to the server where the database lives.
Exactly that. The discussion points out that this application, or service-level enforcement, provides a significantly more granular and tailored way to ensure only specifically authorized access occurs. It aligns enforcement perfectly with the specific needs and sensitivities of the data or functions managed by that application. This layering adds real depth to this security posture.
That makes sense. The source also touches on very specific access needs, like AC314, individual access. This feels particularly relevant for you, our listener, when it comes to something like accessing your own personal data held by an organization.
Oh, definitely. This raises an important question that's pretty central to privacy. How do individuals get to see their own personally identifiable information, their PII, that an organization holds?
Yeah, how I see what they have on me.
Right. AC314, which is an enhancement to AC3, is specifically about requiring the system to provide defined mechanisms to enable individuals to have access to defined elements of their PII that the organization possesses.
Okay, hold on. Defined elements suggest the organization gets to decide what you can see. That sounds a bit limited.
Well, yes and no. That's a key nuance highlighted in the discussion. The organization does define which specific elements of PII are made accessible through these mechanisms. But this isn't arbitrary. It's typically guided by legal requirements, organizational policy, and importantly, risk assessments.
Okay.
The source discussion explains the fundamental why it matters. Providing this access is crucial for transparency. It helps individuals understand how their PI is being processed.
And check if it's right.
Exactly. It's vital for data accuracy, enabling individuals to correct errors in their data. Examples mentioned in the source include specific request forms or interfaces built right into applications. For federal agencies, it points to established processes under the Privacy Act. But the discussion also explicitly notes important caveats. There are circumstances where access might not be appropriate or legally permissible.
Like what?
For instance, the discussion mentions federal law enforcement records might be exempt from certain disclosure requirements under the Privacy Act. And naturally, the source stresses the absolute need for appropriate levels of authentication assurance before granting this access. You need to be sure the person asking is the person whose data it is.
Makes sense.
The discussion also references consultation with privacy officials and legal counsel to determine the proper mechanisms, access rights, and any limitations. And it links this control to related areas like IA8 for non-organizational users, various program management controls, and even privacy training, PT6. It shows how individual data access isn't isolated, it's part of a bigger picture.
It definitely seems like managing who has privileged access is also a massive deal, given the power that comes with it. AC6, least privilege, and its enhancement, AC6-2, non-privileged access for non-security functions, are prominent in the source.
Oh, absolutely critical. These privileges arguably the second most fundamental security principle after access control itself. I mean, really. AC6 mandates granting access to information and system resources based strictly on assigned duties. It's all about minimizing the privileges granted to individuals to the lowest level necessary to perform their job functions. The classic need-to-know principle applied rigorously to system access rights.
Okay.
And the discussion points out this applies not just to people, but also to processes acting on their behalf.
And AC6-2 takes this principle a step further, specifically for those with, like, the powerful admin accounts.
Yes, exactly. AC6-2 is a vital enhancement focusing on managing the risk associated with those privileged accounts. It requires that users who have privileged access to security functions or security-relevant information, think system administrators, security analysts, DBAs.
The keys to the kingdom kind of people.
Right. They must use non-privileged accounts or roles when they were performing non-security tasks.
Okay, explain that. What's a non-security task?
Well, the discussion clarifies what falls under security functions. Things like establishing accounts, configuring authorizations, setting audit parameters, managing intrusion detection settings, that kind of thing. Security-relevant information includes stuff like firewall rules, security service configurations, crypto key info, access control lists. So a non-security task is basically anything else, checking email, browsing the web, using standard Office applications.
So my system administrator friend, when they're just checking their personal email or browsing Wikipedia during a break, shouldn't be logged in with their super administrator account.
Exactly. That's the core idea. The discussion for AC6-2 explains the compelling why it matters. Requiring the use of non-privileged accounts for routine non-security tasks drastically limits the exposure. Think about it. If that privileged account gets compromised while they're just browsing, the damage could be huge. Using the non-privileged account significantly enhances overall security by reducing the attack surface that an attacker could exploit if they compromise that privileged session during a routine task. The discussion notes that using distinct roles within a robust role-based access control system where switching roles effectively changes access authorizations can provide the same assurance as switching between entirely different accounts.
Ah, okay.
And it also lists related controls like AC17 for remote access, AC18 for wireless, AC19 for mobile devices, and PL4 for organizational planning, showing how least privilege connects to, well, pretty much everything involving access.
And before you even start granting access, AC2 seems to be where the rules of the road for access control are actually defined. It's called account management, but sounds broader.
Yes, AC2, despite its title, is foundational because it mandates the establishment of the access control policy and procedures for the system. The source details that the organization must develop, document, and disseminate this policy and these procedures. And they have to cover everything from how access to the system and its information is granted, what the authorization requirements are, and the specific rules that govern that access.
So it's not just about implementing the controls, but having clear written rules about how those controls are applied and managed, like a rule book.
Precisely, a rule book. The discussion highlights specific practical steps required by AC2. The organization must designate a specific organization-defined official, someone with clear responsibility to manage the entire life cycle of the access control policy and procedures, their development, documentation, and getting them out there.
Okay.
And critically, Point C states that both the policy and procedures must be reviewed and updated at an organization-defined frequency and following organization-defined events. This term organization-defined comes up constantly throughout NIST 853.
Organization defined. We see that a lot. What exactly does that mean in practice? Is it just a way for NIST to avoid giving a hard number?
That's a great point to pause on. It's not really about avoidance. When NIST uses organization-defined, it's essentially saying, look, we, NIST, aren't going to tell you the exact value or frequency for this because it depends entirely on your specific organization, your systems, your risk tolerance, and your regulatory environment.
Okay, so it puts the responsibility on the organization.
Exactly. NIST puts the onus on you, the organization, to make a deliberate, documented decision about that specific parameter, whether it's a time frequency like review quarterly, or a list of specific events like after a major system change, or a particular set of users, or a specific control enhancement. It provides flexibility while requiring accountability. You have to decide what frequent means for your system based on your risk.
That clarifies why we see it so often. So AC2 requires defining the policy, reviewing it, and it also gets into the specifics of managing accounts.
It does. That's the account management part of the title finally coming into play. For example, Point J requires reviewing system accounts for compliance with account management requirements. Again, at an organization-defined frequency.
Checking that accounts are still needed, set up right.
Yes. And point I is fundamental. Access to the system must only be authorized based on a valid access authorization and the intended system usage, plus any required organization-defined attributes. This reinforces that granting access isn't automatic. It requires a formal authorized basis tied to necessity.
Right.
There's also AC27, a crucial enhancement specifically for managing privileged user accounts. It demands that these powerful accounts are established and administered according to a clearly defined access scheme, either role-based or attribute-based access control.
Okay.
The assignment of users to these privileged roles or attributes must be monitored, changes to these assignments must be monitored, and critically, access must be revoked when those assignments are no longer appropriate.
Makes sense. Don't leave old admin accounts lying around.
It's exactly. The discussion for this enhancement points out how closely managing privileged accounts, their roles and attributes, is tied to least privilege, AC6, and separation of duties, which is AC5, not in this excerpt, but a related concept. By meticulously managing who has privileged access, you significantly limit the potential damage if such an account is misused or compromised. So AC2 truly is about establishing, maintaining, and enforcing the entire framework for who gets an account and what they can do with it, particularly focusing on the highest risk accounts.
Okay, let's shift our focus to the next family, awareness and training, AT. Because, as we touched on earlier, having all the technical controls in the world doesn't help if the people using the systems aren't aware of the risks or how to behave securely. That human element.
Absolutely. The human element is often cited as the weakest link, right? And the AT controls directly address this by focusing on personnel. The source excerpts highlight AT2 literacy training and awareness and AT3 role-based training. These recognize that personnel aren't just passive users. They need specific knowledge and skills to contribute positively to security and privacy.
Let's start with AT2. Is that the basic training everyone gets, like the annual security refresher?
Yeah, pretty much. AT2 is about providing security and privacy literacy training and awareness to all system users. The goal, as described in the discussion, is broad. Users should understand the need for security and privacy in their daily work.
Why it matters to them.
Right. And know what specific actions they need to take to help maintain security and privacy. This could be things like spotting phishing emails, protecting sensitive documents, locking their screens.
The basics.
The basics, yes. And understanding how to respond appropriately to suspected security or privacy incidents, like who to call if something looks weird. The source mentions specific content areas like operation security and the proper handling of personally identifiable information, PII.
So this is the standard mandatory security training most people encounter.
Exactly. And critically, similar to the AC policies, the source emphasizes that the content of this training and awareness must be updated at organization-defined frequencies and following organization-defined events, AT2C. It's not a one-and-done deal.
Gotta keep it fresh.
You do. The discussion also adds a crucial point, AT22. Organizations should explicitly incorporate lessons learned from internal or external security incidents or breaches into their training techniques. Learning from real-world failures, whether your own or others, makes the training much more relevant and impactful. Remember that phishing campaign last month? Here's how to spot the next one.
Good point. Makes it real.
Yeah. There's also an enhancement, AT26 Cyber Threat Environment, requiring training that specifically addresses the current cyber threat landscape and how that information should be reflected in system operations. The discussion underscores that threat literacy training is inherently dynamic because threats are constantly evolving. What was dangerous last year might be old news today, and new stuff pops up all the time.
And AT3 sounds like it tailors the training to specific roles, gets more specific than the general awareness stuff.
Precisely. AT3 is about providing role-based security and privacy training. It recognizes that different job functions have different security and privacy responsibilities and therefore requires specific, tailored knowledge. The source requires defining which personnel or roles require what type of training. That's an organization-defined assignment again, AT3A.
So an IT administrator would need more in-depth technical security training than, say, someone in the marketing department who only uses standard Office software. Makes sense.
Exactly the point. The training is targeted to ensure individuals understand their specific security and privacy obligations related to their particular job. The timing is also strictly defined in the source. Training must be provided before personnel are authorized to access the system or information or before they perform their assigned duties, AT3A1.
Can't let them loose before they know the rules for their role.
Right. And it must also be provided thereafter at organization-defined frequencies and when required by system changes, AT3A2. So maybe annually, or if their job changes or the system they use changes significantly.
Yeah, okay.
And just like AT2, the content for role-based training must be updated at organization-defined frequencies and following organization-defined events, AT3B. The why it matters is clear. Generalized training isn't enough for everyone. Role-based training ensures individuals have the specific knowledge needed to perform their duties securely and protect sensitive information they interact with as part of their job.
Okay, let's shift gears to Audit and Accountability AU. This sounds like the system's logbook, keeping track of what happens, who did what.
It is, essentially. The AU controls are fundamentally about creating, protecting, and analyzing records of system activity so you can establish accountability. If something goes wrong, you need to be able to trace it back to who or what caused it. This is achieved through audit records, detailed logs of events.
And analyzing those logs sounds like a monumental task for any large system, just wading through all that data.
It is, absolutely. Which is why AU6 audit review, analysis, and reporting is so important. The source excerpts highlight an enhancement here. AU6.1, audit record reduction and report generation automatic processing.
Automatic processing?
Yeah, this calls for implementing capabilities to automatically process, sort, and search audit records. The automatic processing is based on organization-defined fields within audit records. Think about all the different pieces of information in a typical log entry. The time, the user ID, the type of event login, file access, setting, change to the specific system resource or object involved, whether the action succeeded or failed, source and destination IP addresses, and so on.
Lots of details.
Tons. AU6.1 says you need automated tools that can slice and dice this data based on those fields.
Why is that automation so critical? Can't someone just read the logs?
Oh, the sheer volume makes that impossible for anything beyond the smallest systems. The why it matters is very practical. Without automation, analyzing the potentially millions or even billions of log entries generated daily is completely infeasible. It's the classic needle in a haystack problem.
Okay.
Automation makes it possible to sift through all that data to identify specific events of interest. Suspicious login attempts from weird locations, maybe multiple failed attempts followed by a success, attempts to access highly sensitive files, unexpected configuration changes, system errors that might indicate a problem.
So the tools help find the important stuff.
Exactly. The source notes that organizations can define the criteria for these events and the granularity of the processing to meet their specific needs. This is what enables effective monitoring for security incidents and privacy violations in a timely manner.
And protecting the audit information itself seems absolutely crucial. If an attacker compromises the system, the first thing they might do is try to erase their tracks, right? Delete the logs.
Spot on. Protecting the integrity and availability of the audit logs is paramount. If logs can be tampered with or deleted, the entire accountability mechanism just falls apart.
So what does the source say about protecting them? You mentioned AU9.
Yes, AU9 is the control family for this, and AU96, protection of audit information read-only access, is mentioned in the source. This specific enhancement requires authorizing read-only access to audit information only for a organization-defined subset of privileged users or roles.
So even administrators who need to look at logs for troubleshooting or investigation can't change them.
Precisely, or at least only a specific subset of privileged users whose role requires log analysis, but explicitly not log modification, should have right access. The discussion for AU96 explicitly states the why it matters. Restricting modification privileges, even for privileged users, significantly limits the potential for misuse of those accounts, like deleting audit records to conceal unauthorized activity.
Makes sense. Any other protection methods mentioned?
Yeah, the source also mentions other protection methods under AU9, like AU97's store on component with different operating systems.
Storing logs on a machine with a different OS. Why?
It's a defense-in-depth strategy. Storing audit logs on a system component running a different operating system than the system being audited reduces the risk that a vulnerability in the primary system's OS could be used to compromise the audit logs themselves. Say, a Windows vulnerability couldn't directly be used to tamper with logs stored on a Linux server. It also briefly refers to AU91, audit log storage capacity transfer to alternate storage, noting its role in managing storage capacity and potentially protecting logs by moving them off the source system, making them harder to tamper with locally.
The source also mentions AU8 timestamps. Why is having accurate and synchronized time so vital for auditing? It seems basic, but why emphasize it?
Well, this raises an important question that becomes immediately obvious if you've ever tried to troubleshoot an issue across multiple systems. How can you piece together a timeline of events if the clocks on different systems involved in that event are all out of sync?
Right. Things would look like they happened in the wrong order.
Exactly. If System A says something happened at 1:00 p.m. and System B says a related event happened at 1:05 p.m., but their clocks were actually 10 minutes apart, you can't accurately correlate those events. Did A happen before B, after B? You just don't know for sure. AU8 is about providing timestamps for system events.
And the source requires synchronization, not just timestamps.
Yes, AU81, system time synchronization. Synchronization with authoritative time source is the enhancement addressing this. It requires comparing internal system clocks with an organization-defined authoritative time source, typically a highly accurate time server synchronized via NTP, the Network Time Protocol, at an organization-defined frequency.
Okay.
The discussion points out that the selection of the authoritative source and the synchronization frequency should be based on the required granularity of the system's timestamps. Do you need accuracy to the second, millisecond, and the system's security category?
And why does this matter so much?
The why it matters for AU8 and this enhancement is absolutely fundamental for investigations. It ensures that audit records across different system components can be correlated accurately. This synchronized timeline is essential for reconstructing event sequences during security investigations, forensic analysis, or compliance reviews. Without it, trying to understand complex incidents spanning multiple systems becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible. It's foundational for making sense of the logs.
And what about keeping those audit records for a certain amount of time? You can't keep them forever, usually. AU11 audit record retention is in the source.
Right. AU11 is about defining the requirement to retain audit records for a specific organization-defined time period. This period often depends on legal, regulatory, or organizational policy requirements. The source excerpt specifically details the enhancement AU11-1 audit log storage capacity transfer to alternate storage.
We heard about transferring logs under AU91 as well for protection. Is this the same thing, or is there a subtle difference?
That's a very good point to clarify, and the source discussion explicitly addresses it. There is a subtle but important difference in the intent. AU11-1 is about transferring audit logs at an organization-defined frequency to a different system, component, or media than the one doing the logging. The discussion for AU11-1 states its primary purpose is to support the availability of audit logs. especially on systems that might have limited local storage capacity. By moving the logs off the local system regularly, you prevent the logging system from running out of space and potentially stopping logging or overwriting old critical logs.
So it's mainly about making sure you don't lose logs due to space issues.
Primarily, yes. The source notes that while this process of transferring logs is similar to the action described in AU2, which isn't in this excerpt but is a related protection enhancement, the purpose of AU92 is specifically to protect the confidentiality and integrity of audit records by moving them to a more secure location, often a dedicated log server, that the audited system cannot access or modify after the transfer.
Ah, okay. So AU92 is more about preventing tampering, while AU11.1 is more about ensuring you have the logs for the required time.
Exactly. Organizations can choose to implement AU11.1 primarily for storage management and availability, or AU92 for better protection against tampering, or ideally both, depending on their risk assessment and needs. The key is that AU11.1 is focused on managing volume and ensuring the logs are available for the required retention period.
Let's move on to the CA family. Assessment, authorization, and monitoring. This sounds like the ongoing process of checking if your security and privacy controls are actually working and whether the system is officially allowed to operate, like a quality check and sign-off.
That's a good way to put it. The CA family is crucial for establishing confidence in the security and privacy posture and ensuring that risks are understood and formally accepted by management. It involves assessing controls.
Checking if they're doing what they're supposed to.
Right. Checking if they're implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome. Then, based on those assessments and the acceptance of any remaining risk, authorizing the system to operate, and finally, continuously monitoring the environment to ensure the security posture remains effective over time because things change.
Okay. The source mentions CA5 Plan of Action and Milestones. POANMs, I've heard that term. It's basically the list of things you need to fix, right?
Exactly. The dreaded POANM list. CA5 is about developing and updating a plan of action and milestones for the system. Its core purpose is to document the planned remediation actions an organization will take to correct any identified weaknesses, deficiencies, or vulnerabilities in the system or its controls that were found during assessments or monitoring.
So it's the to-do list for security improvements.
Precisely. It's essentially your roadmap for improvement, tracking what needs fixing, who's responsible, and when it's supposed to be done. The source requires that existing POANMs must be reviewed and updated at an organization-defined frequency, based on findings from control assessments, independent audits or reviews, and ongoing continuous monitoring activities, CA5B. You can't just create it and forget it.
So assessments find problems, and the POANM tracks fixing them. It connects finding issues to actually doing something about them.
Exactly. It ties assessment findings directly to a concrete action plan with accountability. And what about the authorization part of the family name? That sounds like a formal sign-off.
It does, like getting official permission to run the system.
It is, very much so. Authorization in this NIST context is defined as the formal decision by senior organizational officials to permit the operation of a system or the use of common controls shared by multiple systems. By granting this authorization, those officials are explicitly accepting the security and privacy risks associated with operating that system or using those controls, based on the evidence from the assessments.
Who makes that call?
The discussion clarifies who typically holds this responsibility for federal agencies, its designated senior federal employees, often called the authorizing official, or AO. These authorizing officials carry significant weight and accountability. They have responsibilities like budgetary oversight and are held directly responsible and accountable for the security and privacy risks related to the systems they authorize.
So it's a big deal.
A very big deal. And the source specifically notes in the general CA discussion, point E, that these authorizations themselves need to be updated at an organization-defined frequency.
So you don't just get authorization once and you're good forever. It's a recurring decision, not a one-time thing.
Absolutely not. The environment changes, the system changes, the threats change. So the authorization needs periodic review and renewal. The why it matters is that authorization is a critical governance step. It elevates the understanding and acceptance of risk to a senior management level, ensuring that system operations aren't proceeding without a formal, documented acceptance of the associated security and privacy risks by someone with appropriate authority and accountability. It links the technical assessment findings, which identify risks, directly to management responsibility and risk acceptance.
And continuous monitoring is the ongoing part of this, right? Keeping an eye on things after authorization to make sure things stay secure.
Exactly. Continuous monitoring provides ongoing situational awareness of the security and privacy posture. It allows organizations to make informed risk decisions over time as the environment changes, new threats emerge, or new vulnerabilities are discovered. It feeds back into the assessment and authorization process. The source excerpt in this section highlights a specific enhancement related to monitoring. CA 1. Continuous Monitoring Independent Assessment. The specific control number for the general continuous monitoring control itself isn't provided in this particular excerpt, but this enhancement about independence is.
Independent assessment for monitoring. Why bring in outside help or someone separate for ongoing monitoring? Wouldn't the system team do that?
Well, this enhancement is all about ensuring impartiality. It involves employing independent assessors or assessment teams to monitor the controls in the system on an ongoing basis. The discussion points out that organizations can maximize the value and trustworthiness of their control assessments, whether they're periodic or continuous, by requiring that they are conducted by assessors who have an appropriate level of independence from the system developers, owners, and operators.
How independent do they need to be?
The required level of independence depends on the organization's overall continuous monitoring strategy and the criticality of the system. For a highly critical system, you might want a completely separate team, or even a third party.
And what defines that independence? How do you ensure they're impartial?
The source provides specific criteria. Assessors should not have conflicts of interest with the organizations or systems they are assessing. Crucially, they should not assess their own work. That's a big one.
Can't grade your own homework.
Right. They shouldn't be acting as management or employees of the organization they are serving in the assessment role. And they shouldn't place themselves in an advocacy position for those organizations or systems. Their job is objective assessment, not cheerleading.
Oh.
The why it matters for using independent assessors is simple but important. It adds a crucial layer of objectivity and trustworthiness to the monitoring results. An impartial assessment is less likely to overlook problems or be influenced by internal pressures or biases, providing management with a more reliable picture of the actual security and privacy posture.
Let's move on to configuration management, CM. This sounds like making sure systems are set up correctly in the first place and that any changes later on are handled carefully. Managing the setup.
It is, and it's absolutely vital for maintaining a known, trusted, and secure state for systems throughout their entire life cycle, from initial setup right through to retirement. CM controls help prevent unauthorized changes that could introduce vulnerabilities, and they ensure that system configurations align with security and privacy policies and requirements. It's about controlling drift from a secure state.
Okay. The source has details on CM2 baseline configuration. What exactly is a baseline configuration in this context? Is it like the default settings?
It's more than just defaults. CM2 is about establishing and maintaining baseline configurations for systems and their components. Think of it as creating a rigorously defined, documented, and formally approved standard setup or starting point for a system. This baseline specifies exactly what hardware, software, firmware, documentation, and even operational procedures should be in place for a system to be considered secure and compliant. It's the known good configuration you aim to maintain and track changes against.
And the source mentions maintaining different baselines for different environments, like testing versus live production.
Yes, CM26, baseline configuration development and test environments, is an important enhancement mentioned. It requires organizations to maintain separate baseline configurations specifically for system development and test environments. And these baselines must be managed separately from the operational baseline configuration used for the live production systems.
Why the separation?
The discussion explains the clear why it matters. Establishing separate baselines helps protect the stability and security of operational systems from potentially disruptive or unexpected events that can occur during development and testing activities.
Yeah.
You don't want to test breaking production.
Definitely not.
It allows organizations to apply the most appropriate configuration management approach for each environment, typically emphasizing strict control and stability for operational systems, while allowing for more flexibility in frequent changes in development or test configurations. However, the source also wisely notes that configurations in the test environment should mirror configurations in the operational environment to the extent practicable, so that testing results are actually relevant to the production environment.
Good point. Test it like you fly it.
Exactly. The discussion adds that maintaining separate baselines doesn't necessarily mean these environments must be physically separate. though logical separation is certainly required.
Managing changes to those baselines and configurations seems like where a lot of risk lies. Someone makes a change, maybe forgets a security setting. What does CM3 configuration change control cover?
This is a critical process for maintaining security over time. CM3 is about systematically managing any proposed and actual changes made to the system. This process includes the formal proposal of a change, justifying why it's needed.
Not just changing things on a whim.
Right. Planning its implementation, testing it thoroughly to ensure it works, and, crucially, doesn't break anything else or introduce a vulnerability, reviewing the results, and formally deciding on its disposition, approval, or rejection.
What kind of changes does this apply to? Big updates, small tweaks?
All sorts. The source says it applies to changes to baseline configurations, individual configuration items like a specific setting, operational procedures, system settings, applying vulnerability remediations like security patches, and even dealing with unscheduled or unauthorized changes that might be discovered.
Does the source provide guidance on who approves these changes? Need some oversight, right?
Yes, the discussion mentions that organizations commonly use governance structures like configuration control boards, CCBs, or change advisory boards, CABs, to review and approve proposed changes, especially significant ones.
Yep.
It also highlights the interaction with privacy requirements. For any system change that is likely to impact privacy risk, the senior agency official for privacy or equivalent must be involved, specifically updating privacy impact assessments, PIAs, and system of records notices, SORNs, as necessary.
And the source mentioned automating parts of this.
It did. CM3.1, Configuration Change Control. Automated documentation, notification, and prohibition of changes encourages using automated mechanisms to streamline this process. Things like automatically documenting the proposed change in a tracking system, notifying the appropriate approval authorities, and even using automation to detect and highlight changes that have been made without going through the proper approval process.
And there's a requirement to check for those unauthorized changes after the fact, too, like auditing the changes.
Absolutely. That's covered by CM3.7, Configuration Change Control Review System Changes. It requires reviewing changes to the system at an organization-defined frequency, or under organization-defined circumstances, specifically to detect whether any unauthorized changes have occurred. This review acts as a detective control, catching changes that might have bypassed the formal process.
So why does all this change control matter so much?
The why it matters for CM3 overall is huge. A robust change control process prevents unauthorized or detrimental modifications to systems that could introduce new vulnerabilities, disrupt operations, or violate privacy requirements. It ensures that changes are deliberate, planned, tested, and approved before they are implemented, maintaining the integrity and security of the system.
Limiting who can make changes sounds equally important. You don't want just anyone messing with configurations. CM5 access restrictions for change is listed in the source.
Yes. CM5 directly addresses the human element in the change process, linking back to access control. It focuses on defining, documenting, approving, and strictly enforcing both physical and logical access restrictions for personnel who are authorized to initiate or implement changes to the system.
So only qualified people get the keys to change things.
Exactly. The discussion section for CM5 highlights that modifications to system components, system software, or even operational procedures can have profound effects on system security or privacy. Therefore, organizations must only permit personnel with the appropriate qualifications and explicit authorization to access systems for the purpose of making changes.
What kind of access restrictions does the source mention? How do you enforce this?
The source lists various examples. This includes using physical and logical access controls, and it explicitly references AC3 for logical and PE3 for physical, showing how these controls connect.
Right, back to AC.
Yeah. Restricting access to software and media libraries where configurations or installation files might be stored, implementing workflow automation that only allows authorized steps by authorized people, using abstract layers or tools to manage changes remotely without requiring direct system login, or restricting changes to predefined change windows. Example, only allowing changes between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on Sundays.
Lots of ways to lock it down.
Definitely. The why it matters for CM5 is straightforward but critical. It ensures that only trusted personnel, following defined and approved processes, are capable of altering system configurations. This dramatically reduces the risk of accidental errors by untrained staff or malicious modifications by unauthorized individuals.
And the source also mentions CM7 least functionality, which seems related to managing what software or services are even running on a system in the first place, kind of like decluttering for security.
That's a great analogy. Yes, CM7 is about minimizing the potential attack surface by ensuring that systems only provide essential capabilities and that unnecessary functions, software, ports, and services are disabled or removed. The source excerpt includes CM7.1 Least Functionality Periodic Review.
So regularly checking if anything unnecessary is running or installed.
Exactly. CM7.1 requires conducting a periodic review of the system at an organization-defined frequency, specifically to identify any functions, ports, protocols, software, or services that are either unnecessary for the system's defined purpose or are known to be non-secure.
And then what? Just note them down.
No, the required action is to disable or remove any identified functions, ports, protocols, software, or services that are deemed unnecessary or non-secure. This decision process itself, what is necessary, must also be organization-defined and documented.
Why is this decluttering so important?
The why it matters for CM7 and its enhancement is incredibly important for reducing risk. Every enabled function, open network port, running service, or piece of installed software represents a potential entry point or vulnerability for an attacker. By ruthlessly removing anything that isn't strictly necessary for the system to perform its required functions, you dramatically reduce the number of potential weaknesses an attacker could find and exploit. Less stuff running means fewer things to attack or break.
Makes sense. There's also mention of managing specifically authorized software with CM7.5 authorized software, though you said it was withdrawn.
Right. The source excerpt notes that CM7.5 itself has been withdrawn and its requirements incorporated into the main CM7 control. However, the discussion related to authorized software is still provided in the source material we have, and it's highly relevant to this concept of least functionality. It elaborates on how an organization can manage what software is permitted to execute on its systems.
How does the source describe that approach to authorized software? What's the strategy?
The discussion outlines a pretty strong approach. It includes employing a deny-all, permit-by-exception policy for software execution on the system. This was referenced as CM7.5b.
Deny all permit by exception. That sounds strict.
It is. It's a powerful security stance. By default, no software is allowed to run unless it's explicitly identified and permitted on a list of authorized software programs, an allow list, essentially.
Oh.
This list of authorized software must then be reviewed and updated at an organization-defined frequency. This was referenced as CM7.5c. The source notes that this control can be applied with great granularity. You can manage executable code at the level of entire applications, APIs, modules, scripts, services, or even specific kernel functions.
So you can get very specific about what's allowed.
Very. It also suggests considering verifying the integrity of authorized software using cryptographic methods like digital signatures, checksums, or hash functions before allowing it to run to make sure it hasn't been tampered with.
And what about code from outside?
Good question. There's also CM7.9 executable code execution from controlled environments, a specific enhancement related to running code from untrusted sources. It requires that if you must execute binary or machine executable code obtained from untrusted sources like free software with no warranty or maybe without source code, you are only allowed to do so within confined physical or virtual machine environments like a sandbox, and only with the explicit approval of organization-defined personnel or roles.
So isolate risky code.
Exactly. The discussion clarifies this applies to all sources of executable code, whether commercial or open source, that are obtained from untrusted sources.
That policy, deny all, permit by exception, sounds like a very effective way to stop malware in its tracks. If it's not on the list, it doesn't run.
It is. The why it matters for managing authorized software and controlling execution environments is fundamental. It prevents the execution of unauthorized or potentially malicious code. This drastically reduces the risk of malware infections, helps block the installation of unwanted or vulnerable software, and maintains the overall integrity of the system by ensuring only trusted, approved software is running.
Finally, in this CM section, CM8 system component inventory comes up. Sounds like just making a list.
It sounds simple, but this control is the absolute starting point for configuration management and arguably for security itself. You simply can't protect what you don't know you have. CM8 is about creating and maintaining a comprehensive, accurate, and complete inventory of system components.
What kind of details should this inventory include, according to the source? It seems like more than just a list of computers, right?
Oh, much more. CM8 requires the inventory to be sufficiently detailed to achieve system component accountability. Point CM8A5 provides a surprisingly extensive list of required information that the inventory should include for each component. Ready?
Lay it on me.
Okay. The system name the component belongs to, software owners and versions, hardware specifications, software license information, network addresses, like IP or MSC addresses for network components, the date the component was received, its cost, model number or serial number, manufacturer, supplier, component type, server, workstation, router, software application, and its physical location.
Wow, that is a lot of data points for each item. That's a serious inventory.
It is. It needs to be comprehensive to be useful.
And does this inventory need to be kept up to date? Things change, equipment gets replaced?
Absolutely. Static inventories are useless inventories. The source explicitly requires reviewing and updating the system component inventory at an organization-defined frequency, CM8B. There's also a key enhancement mentioned, CM8.9, System Component Inventory Assignment of Components to System.
Assignment, what does that mean?
This requires assigning each system component identified in the inventory to a specific system, defining which system it's officially a part of, and getting acknowledgement of this assignment from organization-defined personnel or roles, like the system owner or administrator.
Why is that assignment step so important?
The discussion for this enhancement drives home the why it matters. System components that haven't been formally assigned to a specific system are likely unmanaged. If they're unmanaged, they're probably not getting the necessary security controls applied, not getting patched, not being monitored.
They become rogue devices or shadow IT.
Exactly. And thus, they can quickly become a significant organizational vulnerability. An accurate, detailed, and assigned inventory is truly fundamental for effective configuration management, vulnerability management, incident response, asset management, and overall security risk management. It's the foundation.
Now on to contingency planning, CP. This sounds like having a plan for when, despite your best efforts with all these other controls, things still go wrong. Disasters, outages, breaches.
Exactly. Contingency planning is about ensuring resilience and continuity of essential mission and business functions in the face of disruptions, compromises, or failures that affect systems. It's the what-if planning. The source details CP2 contingency plan.
What does developing a contingency plan involve according to NIST? What goes into it?
Well, CP2 requires developing, documenting, and disseminating a contingency plan for systems. The discussion clarifies that contingency planning is designed to address two main things: system restoration, getting things back online, and implementing alternative processes, how to keep critical functions going if the system is down, when the primary system is compromised, breached, or simply experiences a failure.
So it's not just about fixing the tech, but also about keeping the business running.
Precisely. The force emphasizes that contingency planning isn't an afterthought. It should be considered throughout the entire system development lifecycle and should inform the fundamental design of systems. Thinking about redundancy, backup capabilities, and overall resilience from the beginning makes contingency planning much easier and more effective.
Does the plan need to cover restoring the system exactly as it was before the disruption?
Not necessarily, and that's an important point. The source notes that contingency plans should reflect the required restoration levels. Not every system requires a full mirror image recovery to its pre-disruption state to enable critical functions to continue. Maybe a degraded mode is acceptable temporarily.
Okay.
The objectives for recovery should be defined based on applicable laws, regulations, the organization's risk tolerance, and the system's assigned impact level, low, moderate, or high, based on the potential harm if it's unavailable or compromised. A critical point in the discussion is CP2H. The contingency plan itself must be protected from unauthorized disclosure and modification.
Why protect the plan itself?
Think about it. If an adversary obtains your disaster recovery or contingency plan, they know exactly which systems you consider most critical, what your recovery steps are, where your backups are. They could use that information to specifically target and disrupt your recovery efforts during an incident.
Good point. Don't give them the playbook.
Exactly. The why it matters for CP2 is that a well-developed, documented, tested, and protected plan ensures organizations can respond effectively and efficiently to adverse events, minimize downtime, continue critical mission or business functions, and recover their systems in a structured manner.
The source also talks about alternate sites, like CP6 alternate storage site. Is this for backups?
Yes, CP6 focuses specifically on protecting the organization's data backups by storing them somewhere safe. It requires establishing and maintaining an alternate storage site for system backup information that is geographically distinct from the primary site where the operational system resides.
Geographically distinct, meaning far enough away that the same fire or flood won't hit both.
That's the idea,
Mm.
far enough away to avoid being impacted by the same localized disaster.
What are the key requirements for that alternate site? Just renting some space.
More than that, CP6 requires including necessary agreements to permit the storage and retrieval of system backup information at the alternate site. And crucially, it also mandates ensuring that the alternate storage site provides controls equivalent to those of the primary site.
Equivalent controls, like
Yeah.
security and environment.
Exactly. The discussion points elaborate. This means the alternate site needs comparable environmental controls, temperature, humidity, access rules for the facilities and the stored media, who can get in how, and physical and environmental protection measures, fire suppression, physical security. It also covers coordinating the secure delivery and retrieval of backup media to and from the site.
Why does this matter so much?
The why it matters is straightforward. This provides resilience for critical data. If the primary data storage location is destroyed or becomes unavailable, having an equivalent, geographically separate alternate site ensures your backups are safe and accessible, allowing for recovery and continuation of operations. It's key for disaster recovery.
And what about external dependencies, like the companies providing your internet or phone services? Those are critical for communication. CC9 alternate communications, telecommunications services seems relevant there.
It is very relevant. CP9 is about ensuring alternate telecommunications services are available to support essential functions during a contingency event because reliable communication is often paramount. The source excerpt includes CP9 for Telecommunications Services Provider Contingency Plan, which focuses specifically on the contingency preparedness of the external providers themselves.
So the organization needs to check that its telecom provider has its own backup plan. You have to worry about their continuity, too.
Exactly, because their failure can become your failure. CP9.4 requires organizations to require that their primary and any alternate telecommunication service providers have contingency plans. Furthermore, organizations are required to review those provider contingency plans to ensure they are sufficient and meet the organization's own continuity requirements.
Okay, review their plan.
And this is a key point. Organizations must obtain evidence of contingency testing and training conducted by the providers at an organization-defined frequency, CP9.4C.
Wow. Obtaining evidence of testing and training goes way beyond just asking if they have a plan. It's about confirming they actually practice it and it works.
Precisely. It's about gaining assurance, not just taking their word for it. The discussion notes that organizations may need to respect the proprietary nature of provider plans. During reviews, the provider might not share every detail, and a summary might be sufficient sometimes. However, the requirement to see evidence of testing and training is crucial for gaining real confidence.
So why does this matter?
The why it matters is clear. This control helps ensure the organization's ability to communicate internally and externally is maintained during disruptions, even if the provider's infrastructure or services are affected. It acknowledges that critical external dependencies, like your ISP or phone company, are links in your own continuity chain and must have their own preparedness measures in place.
After a disruption hits, how do you actually get systems back up and running? The recovery part. CP10 system recovery and reconstitution is in the source.
Yes. CP10 addresses the crucial process of returning systems to a functional state after an incident or failure. The control requires providing for the recovery and reconstitution of this system to a known state, presumably the secure and authorized baseline state we talked about under CM, within an organization-defined time period.
Okay.
And this time period must be consistent with the system's defined recovery time objectives, RTO, and recovery point objectives, RPO.
RTO and RPO. Can you quickly define those?
Sure. RTO, recovery time objective, is the target maximum time allowed between the disruption and restoring the business function. How fast you need to be back up. RPO, recovery point objective, is the target maximum amount of data loss you can tolerate, measured in time. How recent does the restored data need to be? An hour old, a day old.
Got it. Time to recover versus how much data loss is okay. The source mentioned recovery and reconstitution. What's the difference?
Good catch. The discussion section clarifies this. Recovery is the process of executing contingency plan activities specifically to restore essential organizational mission and business functions, typically getting systems up and running, perhaps in a degraded or interim state initially.
Getting lights back on.
Right. Reconstitution takes place following successful recovery. It includes activities for returning systems to their fully operational normal state. This might involve deactivating any interim capabilities or workarounds that were used during the emergency recovery phase, conducting thorough assessments to ensure the fully restored capabilities are secure and correct, and potentially reestablishing continuous monitoring, and maybe even needing a formal reauthorization process if required by policy or the nature of the disruption.
So recovery is getting it working, reconstitution is getting it back to normal.
Exactly. The entire process should reflect the organization's mission and business priorities and be aligned with those defined recovery objectives. R-Torpo. The why it matters for CP10 is having a defined, planned, and tested process to restore systems efficiently and effectively after an incident, minimizing downtime, data loss, aligned with RPO, and the overall impact on mission business operations.
Finally, for CP13 alternative security mechanisms is mentioned. What's this about?
This control is interesting because it's about building resilience directly into the security capabilities themselves. CP13 requires employing organization-defined alternative or supplemental security mechanisms for satisfying organization-defined security functions, specifically when the primary means of implementing that security function is unavailable or has been compromised.
So having a backup plan for your security tools or methods themselves, like a backup for your firewall or authentication.
Yes, that's a good way to think of it. The discussion explains this control supports system resiliency, contingency planning, and continuity of operations. These alternative mechanisms might not be as robust or effective as the primary ones, but their availability means that critical security functions can still be performed, even if degraded, preventing a complete stop in operations that might otherwise be necessary until the primary mechanism is restored.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The example provided in the discussion is illustrative. If the primary means of authentication, say multi-factor authentication using hardware tokens, is compromised or unavailable, maybe the token server goes down, the organization might have a documented alternative like issuing secure one-time pads or temporary passwords via a secure channel to key personnel to allow essential access.
Okay, so the fallback security measure.
Exactly. The source notes that due to the potential cost and effort involved, these alternative or supplemental mechanisms are typically implemented only for critical security capabilities, not for everything. The why it matters is enabling the organization to continue critical operations and maintain a baseline of security, even if it's temporarily degraded, when the primary security defenses are temporarily disabled, bypassed, or unavailable. It's security resilience.
Our final family for this deep dive is identification and authentication, IA. This sounds pretty straightforward, figuring out who or what is trying to access your system and verifying their identity, like logging in.
It is, essentially, but it goes a bit deeper than just user logins. This family is fundamental to ensuring that only legitimate users and devices are interacting with your systems. It's not just about people. The source includes IA3, device identification, and authentication.
Device identification, so not just knowing who is logging in, but what device they're using, like my specific laptop.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
IA3's core concept is to uniquely identify and then authenticate organization-defined devices and other types of devices before allowing them to establish a connection, whether that connection is local, remote, or over the network.
Which devices need this? All of them.
Not necessarily. The organization gets to define which specific devices or categories of devices require this identification and authentication process. Maybe it's required for servers connecting to each other or for laptops accessing sensitive internal networks, but not for, say, a printer.
How do you authenticate a device?
The source mentions various methods, ranging from relying on shared known information like MPI or TCP/IP addresses, though the source implies these are less robust and can be spoofed, to employing more secure organizational authentication solutions, like using certificates with 802.1x EAP protocols or Kerberos tickets for devices in a domain. The required strength of these device authentication mechanisms, according to the source, should be determined based on the security categories of the systems being accessed and the mission or business needs. Higher-risk systems need stronger device authentication. The discussion acknowledges that implementing device authentication on a very large scale across an entire organization can be challenging, so organizations can limit its application to a specific number or type of devices based on their risk assessment.
And why does this matter? Why authenticate the device too?
The why it matters is clear. By authenticating devices, you help ensure that only authorized, trusted endpoints are connecting to your system. It adds another layer of defense against unauthorized access attempts originating from unknown or potentially compromised machines, even if the user credentials are correct. It helps prevent rogue devices from joining your network.
And what about users who aren't employees? We talked about training them, but how do you identify them? IA8 identification and authentication, non-organizational users, specifically addresses people outside the organization.
Yes, IA8 is a crucial control for scenarios where external users need access to your systems. Think business partners accessing a shared portal, contractors needing system access, customers logging into an online service, or citizens interacting with government services online.
Okay.
It requires uniquely identifying and authenticating these non-organizational users or any processes that are acting on their behalf. The why it matters is that security and privacy risks aren't confined to internal personnel. Extending strong access control and accountability to external users accessing the system is essential to protect sensitive data and system resources. This control acknowledges the need to verify identities and establish accountability even when those individuals are not part of the organization's standard employee directory or internal identity management system. You need a way to manage these external identities securely.
Identity proofing sounds like the step before you even get an account, verifying you are who you say you are initially. IA12 identity proofing is in the source.
It is exactly that. IA12 describes a formal process of collecting, validating, and verifying a user's identity information specifically for the purpose of establishing official credentials and system accounts. It's the onboarding identity check.
What does it require?
The control requires identity-proofing individuals who require accounts for logical access to the system. This process must be performed based on appropriate identity assurance level, IAL requirements, defined in applicable standards and guidelines, like NIST Special Publication 863 for digital identity. The required steps include resolving user identities to a unique individual, making sure one person doesn't have multiple identities unless permitted, and collecting, validating, and verifying the identity evidence they provide, like checking government ID, matching biometrics, etc., depending on the required IAL.
Why is this initial step so critical? Why not just let people sign up?
The discussion explains that identity proofing is designed to mitigate threats related to user registration and account establishment. The fundamental why it matters is ensuring that the person requesting an account is genuinely who they claim to be, rather than a malicious actor creating a fraudulent account under a false or stolen identity. Without proper identity proofing at the start, all subsequent security controls tied to that identity access controls, auditing could be bypassed by someone using a false persona. It anchors the digital identity to a real person.
Makes sense. The source also includes IA12 identity proofing except externally proofed identities. What's that about?
This enhancement is about efficiency and collaboration, particularly in federated environments. It allows organizations to accept identities that have already been proofed by other trusted agencies or organizations, provided that the original proofing was conducted at a commensurate level of assurance, IAL, as required by the receiving organization's policy and the system's assurance level needs.
So if someone has already been vetted by another trusted entity to a certain standard, say another government agency or a partner company, you don't necessarily have to make them go through the whole identity proofing process again from scratch to access your system.
Exactly. As long as you trust the original proofing process and it meets your required assurance level, the discussion notes the practical why it matters. It limits unnecessary reproofing, which can be burdensome for users and organizations, especially for users who don't possess standard organizational credentials like PIV, personal identity verification cards, issued by the federal government.
Yeah, avoids redundant effort.
Right. It also states that accepting externally proofed identities is a fundamental component of managing federated identities, enabling secure access and collaboration across multiple agencies and organizations without requiring each one to perform the same identity proofing process from scratch every time. This control supports establishing trust with external parties while maintaining appropriate identity assurance levels for access. So, wow, we've really covered a lot there. In this deep dive, we've walked through those initial foundational families outlined in this NIST document: access control, awareness and training, audit and accountability, assessment, authorization and monitoring, configuration management, contingency planning, and identification and authentication. Quite a mouthful.
It is. And even within just these first few areas, these clauses 3.1 through 3.7, you can clearly see how interconnected everything is. It's not just a checklist.
Not at all.
From the foundational policies and procedures in AC and CA to the technical implementation of controls like access enforcement or logging, the crucial human element addressed by AT, and the ongoing processes of checking work, CA, managing changes, CM, planning for disaster, CP, and verifying identities, IA.
Exactly.
These controls aren't just abstract requirements, they are the deliberate building blocks organizations use to establish trust, ensure accountability, and manage risk effectively in how they handle sensitive information and operate critical systems.
Yeah, understanding these foundational controls really gives you a much clearer picture of the layers of defense and the specific documented processes that are necessary. It highlights the importance of those deliberate decisions, all those organization-defined elements we talked about, plus thorough documentation and continuous activities like training, monitoring, updates, and reviews. They really are the bedrock upon which, all the other more specialized security and privacy controls are built.
Hopefully, breaking down these sections, going through them control by control, as instructors might, has given you some new insights into these essential concepts and maybe sparked some further curiosity about how the rest of the NIST control catalog builds upon this foundation.
And this raises, I think, an important question for you to consider as you reflect on what we've discussed. Given how fundamental these initial controls are, governing who gets in, training people, recording actions, checking work, managing changes, planning for disaster, and verifying identities, how do potential weaknesses or failures in these basic building blocks inevitably create cascading problems? How do they complicate the implementation and effectiveness of all the more advanced security and privacy controls that come later in the catalog and rely on this foundation being solid?
That is a truly crucial thought to leave you with. How solid is the foundation? That's all for this deep dive. We hope you found it valuable.